Welcome to Subject to Power. I'm El Kemihira. A little bit of a trigger warning. In this episode, we'll be talking extensively about the murder of women. So take care when listening. It's a grim subject matter, but I feel compelled to report on what we call femicide or feminicide, because in some ways, the murder of women because they're women is the ultimate and final outcome of the unequal status of women across the world. My guest on this episode, data analyst and author Catherine D'Ignacio, has written a book called Counting Feminicide, Data Feminism in Action, which is about the people who made it their life's work to track and make a permanent record of the women killed in their respective countries. To put this work in perspective, and you'll hear much more about this in our conversation, keeping statistics on femicide is for the most part not done by any governments or law enforcement in any countries, anywhere. We know some large approximate numbers, but most of them, like the UN Women's 2018 figure of 87,000 women killed around the globe that year, are considered severe undercounts. We do have large criminal justice systems tasked with handling male violence. We have whole media genres dedicated to telling the stories of male violence, much of it featuring murdered women. But when it comes to tallying the actual lives taken of women and girls, most countries in the world just don't do it. In this episode, we talk about the people, mostly across the Americas, who decided to pick up the job of counting women killed, independently and unpaid, and how they turned this work into a powerful activist movement. I have trouble introducing you with one title because you have so much going on.
Sure.
Your work takes so many forms. You're a data analyst, if I get that right. You are director of the Data and Feminism Lab at MIT. You're a writer, you're a feminist, and you wrote a book called Data Feminism, and now you just published a new book called Counting Feminicide, Data Feminism in Action. So maybe you can tell me a little bit about your work in general and what prompted writing this book and what the book is.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Well, so for Counting Feminicide, I came to it through the first book. So in Data Feminism, Lauren Klein and I wrote this book, Data Feminism, that broadly tries to answer this question of like, what does a feminist approach to data science look like? And in that book, we talk pretty briefly, like there's just a couple pages about this one case study of a woman named Maria Salguero, who's in Mexico. And she produces basically a citizen database of feminicide, so gender-related killings of women and girls. And she's been doing that work now at this point for like 8 years. And so in Data Feminism, we talk about that as an example of how when governments and institutions fail to produce the data that people are demanding for kind of important social justice reasons, then increasingly it's this strategy of like counter data in terms of where like citizen groups, activists, communities, nonprofits, journalists step in and do some of that data quantification work that institutions are failing to do or neglecting to do. And so that's sort of how we wrote about it there. And then building on data feminism, I was so fascinated by this story and her case that I started thinking, well, she's part of this broader movement called Ni Una Menos, not one less woman, coming out of Latin America. And are there other people like her? So that was kind of my question. And I started connecting with folks and asking questions. It turns out there are many, many other people and groups that are working in very similar ways to Maria Salguero. She happens to be, I think, one of the most well-known and well-covered by the press. And so I started a collaboration with one of these other folks who does this work in Uruguay. Her name is Elena Suarez Val. and then our mutual colleague, Silvana Fumega. And we said, maybe we'll write a paper about this work, because Elena knew a couple of data activists as well, because she'd been doing this work of data activism about feminicide for Uruguay. So we're like, okay, we'll interview a couple of people, call it a day, probably write some research paper about it as a form of activism. But in fact, what happened is we started with this list of who was doing this work. We broadened the list, and it turned out actually there's hundreds of groups working in this way. In particular, we were looking particularly at the Americas, so mainly like Latin America and North America. But we also collected global groups when we came across them. And one thing led to another, and we started interviewing groups and talking to them. And then their practices were just so fascinating. And so there's so many commonalities, even despite all the geographic differences in how and why they do this work. And so that's kind of what led me to undertake a book project about it, because in fact, it was far larger and sort of more important a phenomenon. I felt like it really needed to be out there as a book. It felt like a interesting enough phenomenon that it needed to be out there more, and just such a widespread phenomenon that at least for me was under my radar. Like I really hadn't known about it until I went looking for it.
And what made you focus on South America, or like the Americas particularly?
The original connection, Maria's in Mexico, so that's where her work is based. And then my collaborators, one is in Argentina and one is in Uruguay. And then the fourth one is from Brazil. The way that I see it is like, the center of gravity of this anti-feminicide movement is really in Latin America. Like, I think it's just where the feminist movements are so strong right now on this issue. And so there's just so much work and activity happening along those lines. And so that's why, as we looked, we tried to look systematically at all the countries in Latin America, Central America, and North America. And there's efforts in almost every country. There's just so many more in Latin America. I guess I would say there's so many projects. There's data journalism projects. There's academic research projects. There are observatories. There's nonprofit groups. It's a pretty intense period of like organizing around this issue. And so I think that's also like something where kind of Northern America or like Anglo feminism can actually like learn a lot too by some of the strategies that Latin American feminist movements are pursuing there.
You talk about this work in feminist terms, and you outline it kind of in 7 principles, which I think is really interesting. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, the 7 principles are the principles of data feminism. And those are the principles that Lauren and I came up with in the first book. In that case, those were really derived from thinking about, if we're going to bring feminist principles into data science, what kinds of things need to change about data science or be sort of reformulated in order for us to actually do feminist data science. And so the first 2 principles are examine power and challenge power. And in a way, those are like the foundational principles. And they are not what I would call, they're not practiced often in conventional data science or mainstream data science the way that we teach and learn it in schools. Because examining power and challenging power are about this idea of sort of acknowledging that our current system is unequal, and it's unequal based on sexism and so on, but also based on other, and the reason we say power and not just like examine sexism or something is that we're using this idea of intersectional feminism, so that like our realities are shaped by these like multiple intersecting forms of domination, which includes, of course, sexism, but also racism, classism, et cetera, et cetera. And so the first charge, I guess I would say, for like a feminist data science is to first understand how power works. And that's actually something that I think data science is really well suited for. It's really good at looking at these sort of macro scale structural phenomenon. That's sort of the point of when you aggregate a bunch of things into a spreadsheet and analyze them. The idea is to show trends and patterns and so on. So in fact, like I think that data science is a great method, in fact, for examining power. But then like the feminist position doesn't stop there, because it's not enough just to say, well, like, let's understand it. And this is often where, like I would say, my critique of like just pure sort of academia would come in. It's like we don't get free by having more perfect descriptions of power, but we actually need to also take action to change things. And so that's why the second principle is around challenging power. So if we've now used data science to examine and understand power and how it functions in any given topic or area, how do we then intervene and actually change it? Because there's a kind of, and this is where a feminist position is an activist position, because it starts from the standpoint of like, things are not all right with the world, and it's our responsibility to bring into being the world where all genders are equal, and where people's lives and livelihoods are not affected by these structural forces of oppression. And so we have to think about how do we use data science to do that. And then the other principles are also very important, but go on to talk about things like context, considering context in data science, which is often so frequently ignored actually in data work. Embracing pluralism, so bringing more voices to the table in any given knowledge-making process. Making labor visible, so thinking about all the labor that goes into data curation, production, data analysis, and so on. And rethinking binaries and hierarchies. So taking the gender binary as itself a kind of like a harmful technology, and then using that as a way to think through what are the categories and classifications we use that can actually liberate us as opposed to like reduce us and harm us. So that whole principle is around kind of like how do we classify and categorize things, which is such a frequent operation in data science. So those principles are not, we didn't just like pull them out of our heads. We're sort of like reading from feminist theory, literature, activism over decades, and then saying kind of like which sort of feminist approaches are most relevant when we're thinking about working with data and data analysis.
It was a fascinating read for me, just to applying these lenses together. Just gives a whole new picture of the world, really. Another principle that stuck out to me was elevate emotion and embodiment, which I thought was very interesting.
That whole principle is around how we so often in data work, again, we think in binaries often, and like in data work, we often exclude emotion as a kind of valid way of knowing the world or valid way of approaching the world, and prioritize the rational over the emotional. But in fact, one of the things that's so interesting about the feminicide data activists' work, the way that they care for their data, what they're doing is they're actually producing spreadsheets about people who have been killed in gender-based violence. And so literally like each row of their spreadsheet is a person. It's how they lived, it's how they died, it's what method of death. There's often like extreme sort of details collected about them. And one of the really interesting things that we found in talking to these activists is that there was an amazing way in how they conceive of their databases. And they conceive of their databases as these sacred sites of memorialization, which is a very different, I should just say, as in my background, like I have a background as a software programmer and also a database programmer. It's just not a way that I was ever taught to relate to a database. You know what I'm saying? Like nobody ever said like your database of projects is going to be a sacred site, you know, like, and yet the ways in which these groups relate to their data, they really care for them as a kind of representation of the lives that we have lost. Like, for example, Elena, who's my collaborator on the project, at one point, she and I were doing this class and we were teaching other activists and journalists how to think about feminicide and data together. So doing this like workshop. And I suggested, I was like, why don't they just use your database for this exercise? Like they can do this like charting exercise with the spreadsheet produces like this open spreadsheet of feminicide cases for Uruguay. And she pushed back on that. And she was like, no, these data are not for play. They're not for using in this context, even of like learning. And she felt that it would in fact be disrespectful to use the data in that way, even though like the people we're teaching are very aligned, like politically, they would not be doing anything, you know, overtly disrespectful. But I just thought that was a really interesting position to be taking, where you're treating the data as if they have a much, much richer connection to our physical, material, and our spiritual world than we normally think of data having, right? We normally would never be like, sure, use the data, open data, have the data, everybody, you know? I found that to be really moving. And I saw examples of that over and over again in these feminicide data activism projects is the level of care and emotional investment and would you say respect for who the people who the data represent was really astounding.
The big sort of question that hangs over this work for me is all of these grassroots organizations and activists are doing the work that is not being done by big government organizations, whether it's law enforcement or justice system or some sort of larger states, are incredulously not not counting and keeping track of women murdered. And so you go through a lot of the different ways that feminicide is hidden or baked into other things. If you can talk a little bit about that, like how the whole work of defining feminicide.
I think what you mentioned about whose job is this? That is a really fascinating question. And different groups answer it differently. But in a number of groups, there was this very real acknowledgement that they are doing the work of the state. Like they don't want to be doing this work. And in fact, they do this work to hopefully try to responsibilize the state to take it on, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, to be quite honest. Like it was very interesting, like in Guatemala, for example, the group that's monitoring there was of exactly this viewpoint, like that they're doing this work that really the state should be doing. They want the state to take it on. And yet the interesting thing that's happened in their case is like now they're working in partnership with the state, but the state still is not doing the work, if that makes sense. And they're still doing the work, but the state is giving them legitimacy in the sense that it is taking their numbers as real numbers. It's treating their numbers as very valid numbers, but it's not resourcing them. And it's also not providing them with the institutional access that would be needed to actually have a comprehensive count. That's the other place where the activists themselves have real tensions about their work, because for the most part, they're all using the media, like the news media, and then other different kinds of mechanisms like sometimes social media, at least to get leads on cases. Other times, like crowdsourced tips once they get well known enough. Like Maria Salguero, for example, like people send her things all the time because she's very famous. So they know that she's counting and they'll send her information. But if you are monitoring from media, the groups know this is so biased, right? Because like the media are biased, first of all, but also the media are not present evenly across the whole geography. So especially in like a large country like Brazil or the United States, like we have media deserts where that are just they're places where there are no local media. And in fact, the concentration of media has gotten way worse in the past 20 years. So there's less coverage of like rural areas. So folks know there's so many cases that they miss. It's like everybody undertakes the work with this, I would say, deep sense of what its limitations are. Not all of them, but a lot of them want the government to do the work. But in the absence of the government doing the work, they step in and try to use it as a lever of change to make the government, to try to like responsibilize the government or other institutions to actually do the work at scale, which is requires resources, frankly.
And part of it, or related, I feel like, is that when you bake feminicide in with homicide or other violence, you lose that men and women die very different deaths, right? Men are involved in violence against each other in certain contexts, which you maybe want to talk about. And so in a way, it's about like distinguishing the nature of how women die and or are killed and how men are killed.
Exactly. That's exactly why I think it's so important to have a kind of like a gender disaggregated approach because there are truly very different patterns in the way that homicide unfolds for men and women. And so, like with women, people often ask the feminicide data activists, like, oh, why are you only focusing on women? But it's exactly the point is that there are these like deeply gendered patterns for the ways and the reasons in which women are killed. So, like men, well, occasionally, very occasionally, they are killed by their intimate partners. Women are killed in vastly higher numbers by their intimate partners or domestic partners than men are. Women's bodies are often used and marked in these like very grotesque and sexualized ways when they are killed versus men who don't have the equivalent kind of sexualization traces of sexual violence actually undertaken sort of on the body. Just the fact that these differences are so striking makes a gendered analysis, I think, really necessary. And yet, even though we know that, like we know this academically, we know this from so much research, still in sort of like national statistics, national judicial systems, there's very little actual like disaggregation and looking into these patterns that actually happens. And there's very little, let's say, like sensitization on the part of authorities to understand even like how to investigate these cases properly as well.
You do talk about like how they're hidden, particularly in like turf wars or civil unrest or narco trafficking. There's certain, it's kind of like male violent enterprise, and the murder of women gets hidden into that.
That's exactly right. One of the interesting things from interviewing all these different groups in different places is that we saw groups have different categories for violence in these different places that face exactly these kinds of things. So, for example, with places like Mexico or like Colombia, where there's high amounts of narco trafficking and even what you might call like territorial domination of space by the narco groups, where they're literally like controlling large swaths of territory. A lot of what they do is also tied up with violence against women. So people's partners or wives are killed as a way of sending messages across different groups. They're often sexualized or brutalized in ways that are, and folks have very much written about this. Rita Segato and Latin American feminists have written about this. Julia Moñarez about like kind of messages on the body. So like women's bodies really used as information vehicles, but like through violence. Women get caught up in these things that are not necessarily of their making, but they end up being used as part of these struggles over territory, money, and so on. There's ways that gender violence connects to things like climate change, for example, that we don't tend to think about, but it's like women end up being more vulnerable when they're in a situation of like climate migration. So when there's like, say, huge floods, or even economic and political collapse, as we're seeing, for example, in Venezuela, which is forcing a huge migration, the folks who are monitoring feminicide in Colombia have a whole category for the feminicide of Venezuelan migrants because it's a case that they're seeing so frequently because these women come, they're vulnerable because they don't have economic resources, they're health and housing or food insecure. And so they're much more vulnerable then as well to gender related violence. So there's all these ways in which these issues, they intersect with other issues, or they're kind of like byproducts of these other structural forces that are going on.
Sort of tying back to what you were talking about before about the narrative, I thought it was interesting that the accepted way, and this is very much the case in this country too, that to talk about the murder of women as a personal crime, because it is so often intimate partner crime. But the data activists that you write about are really emphasizing that it's a combination, or trying to change the narrative that it's a combination personal crime and a state crime. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, sure. And I think this is one of the most interesting sort of functions of femicide or feminicide as a concept. And this is one of the underlying goals of the activists is to try to, in a way, like theorize or assert that this is a structural category of violence to challenge the narrative we so often see in the mainstream media. Like if, let's say, a husband killed a wife, right? Like typically the news media, and this is actually a pattern across most countries, unfortunately, so it's an unfortunate pattern, but typically the news will characterize it as an interpersonal crime. The husband was jealous. The wife was trying to leave him. The husband had a fit of rage. The husband caught the wife cheating. Whatever the sort of circumstances might be, it's painted as this individual person is in this specific relationship, and then they went unhinged for some reason, and they killed their wife. And what the feminist activists would argue is not that we shouldn't prosecute, and this needs to be treated as a crime as it is in most places at the individual level. And yet, when we write about it, when we think about it, and when we analyze it, we need to think about it in relationship to a larger phenomenon. Because in fact, there is this one husband in this one town who might have killed his wife. But in fact, we need to think about the idea that this is linked to the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other cases where the intimate partner also had a fit of rage and also killed their wife and also is having these same circumstances. It's actually illustrative of this much larger structural pattern. In some cases, and actually even in some countries, it's still viewed as okay to actually kill your wife because your wife is actually technically your property. And so this is sort of like our inheritance of patriarchy, as it were. That's, I would say, the thrust behind this idea of feminicide is saying, okay, fine, this individual crime happened, address it through the legal system. But also when we consider it, we need to place it into its larger context and have a name for it as this broader phenomenon. And in fact, the folks advocating for this term and category would also enlarge it beyond just the intimate partner frame. Often in English, we talk about like intimate partner violence, or we talk about domestic violence. And so those are certainly two prevalent forms of violence, either one that happens in the home or one that is perpetrated by the intimate partner. But there's these other forms of gender-related violence that are not quite captured by either the place or the person who's doing the violence. And once we enlarge it, we can see those are all part of the same phenomenon, which is like the subordination of women, broadly speaking, and which then leads to the violence against women in a variety of different formats perpetrated by a variety of different perpetrators. So not just intimate partner, but potentially family members, potentially other community members, potentially clients, employers, so on and so forth. And so the assertion, and it's made through data, which I think is one of the most interesting things about it. So the assertion is that all of those are linked and they have the same underlying root cause, and we need to think about them that way.
A sort of universal devaluation of women's lives, it feels like.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly.
You do talk about, in the South American context, you talk about that they have a term for it, saying neoliberal feminicidal violence. What do they mean by that?
Yeah, that's in Colombia. That was a term that group specifically arrived at. And for them, it's a type of feminicide that is linked to the kind of artificial precarity of women's economic status, basically. And so it's very much linked to economics and economic policies. What they saw happen in Colombia was a wide range of policies that were about producing gender differences. Like men have more access to the wage labor market, they have more stable jobs, they have more stable healthcare. Women were very much more kind of like pushed into informal work sectors, unremunerated labor. And so because of that lower economic status, we're actually more vulnerable to feminicide. And so this is, again, I think honestly kind of like the genius of the Latin American feminists is they're always thinking like more structurally in a way. So they're kind of like linking what would happen in these interpersonal realms of like a woman is killed on the street corner, a woman is killed in that home, to these broader economic policies as a way of saying, if we actually provided a social safety net for women, we can reduce a number of these deaths over here. Women are kind of subject to this violence because these economic policies themselves are actually violent.
You do talk about, and now we're maybe get a little academic here, about the epistemology of ignorance.
Yes.
I love Charles Mills for that. And it is just such an interesting way of looking at it, how we essentially, the culture produces ignorance. Can you talk about it in terms of feminicide?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I also found very interesting. Charles Mills, in this case, is like he is writing at this time where he's thinking about white people in the United States and their ignorance of their own forms of domination. So, this idea that sort of like when white people claim, probably legitimately, like they don't see racism, it's because they've been brought up in the system in which their own domination is invisible to them. And so I think, yeah, the same is true with feminicide, where in a sense, like we are surrounded by gender related violence, and yet we almost choose to ignore it, or we choose to normalize it, or we choose to justify it. So we end up in this system where by refusing to kind of name it or refusing to make it something that is unacceptable, we sort of participate in its perpetuation. I mean, I think in the book I'm writing specifically, when I'm talking about ignorance, I am writing specifically too about this concept of missing data. It's almost unbelievable that the governments are not collecting this data, in particular where the governments have laws on the books. In a place like the United States, we actually don't have a law specifically about feminicide, but like in the Latin American context, literally nearly every Latin American country has now passed a law about feminicide or femicide. So one of those two things is codified in law. And yet there's still no official information in most countries that is reliable and public and corresponds in any way to the activist statistics. Because typically the activists have like far more complete data somehow than the government. It's one of these things where there's really interesting reasons, in my mind, for reasons why a government would not want to count also, because a government, in a way, if they count and measure something, they're admitting that they're responsible for it at some level. And if they count and measure something and the figures look really bad, then they actually have to take some action about it. In fact, there was a kind of funny anecdote from Puerto Rico about this, where there's this like grandma basically who does the counting in Puerto Rico. She has the most reliable, up-to-date statistics about feminicide, much better than the government. And she asked one of the government officials, well, like, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you all keeping the numbers? And he said, oh, well, because, he said it very straightforwardly, because people will think we're not doing our jobs then. And she was like, well, it's true. You're not doing your job. But so I think it's like epistemology of ignorance sort of comes back to like who has the will to know something. And in many cases, it's like in the state's interest to not know and to not count because they're afraid of knowing, because they're afraid of being responsible, right?
And at a time where we keep statistics and data on absolutely everything, and not that.
When it's actually something that's pretty easy to measure. I mean, there are other things that I think are quite complex to measure, just the way that they either get reported or that they're very stigmatized, figures on things like sexual assault or child abuse, or, there's lots of things I think are much harder to measure, but this is one of those most final forms of violence. And so typically we do have records on death, and we could certainly know more about method of death enough to determine whether it was feminicide or not, if, again, we cared, if there were the political will. So I think that's so much of what the activists are targeting here.
Yeah, breaking through this willful ignorance and trying to hold the larger sort of governmental organizations responsible for what they should be doing. You talk about undercounting in that sense. And this whole idea of counter data, which I think is that's kind of at the crux of it, I suppose.
Yeah, counter data is sort of the one way to try to address this idea of missing data. Missing data is when our institutions, despite political demands from people, from constituents to count something, when they still persist in not counting that thing or not measuring that thing or not keeping records on that thing. So data that people want, but that institutions are not producing. So I think it's like where counter data comes in is as a kind of a strategy then, because when governments fail to produce information that people think is important and that we need, then increasingly, I think a very interesting strategy that's becoming more and more prevalent, people, either whether it's individuals or then journalists, explicitly activist people, small nonprofit organizations, communities, they're the ones who are like kind of stepping into those data gaps and then collecting the data themselves. And so this is basically the work of pretty much all the groups in the book is exactly this, where they have decided that the figures that are out there are either non-existent or they're dubious or of bad quality or something like that. So we're going to collect the data ourselves. And now within that, the undercounting thing is interesting and comes back to something I said at the beginning is like the activists who are doing this counting of feminicide, they know they don't have complete counts. Like I was saying, like they know that their counts are partial. They do the best they can with the information at hand and the sources at hand, which are mostly media and social media and so on. But they know that whatever they have is like, it's like a minimum. They know there's always more than they've been able to actually find. And it's a tension they wrestle with, and no groups are like claiming any kind of comprehensiveness because they're actually I found them very sophisticated in terms of the way they work with data. Like they're very savvy also with communicating about it. It's like, these are the best figures we have. They're from counts of the media. We know there's more than this ultimately. But I think one of the interesting ways they've been able to leverage counter data, which again, they're so savvy about it, is because once you have numbers, folks do pay attention in ways that they don't otherwise pay attention, let's say to testimonies or to stories or experiences or something like that. And so when these activist groups go and say, the government claims this many feminicides, we've actually counted this many, and they publish some pretty savvy and beautiful looking charts of visualizations, the media pay attention. And so they get amplified in the media. And often they also get the attention of the government institutions who they're trying to push on.
In addition to your South and Central American activists, you talk about two North American data activists, Dawn Wilcox and Anita Lucchesi of Sovereign Bodies Institute. Can you just give me a little bit of what those two activists are up to?
Yeah, they're both longstanding partners of this project. And Dawn Wilcox is the founder of Women Count USA. And she's an amazing just person, I want to say in general. We've ended up collaborating with her a lot. And she is a nurse who lives in Texas. For years now, she has been, I think she considers it her life's work to be keeping databases of feminicide in the US context specifically. And so she does this by doing Google searches, by going through other databases. So databases like the FBI's database, gun violence archive database, and so on and so forth. And I would really characterize her as like a scientist and criminologist. She is so, I would say, knowledgeable in terms of the patterns of feminicide that we see in the United States context. And people have actually invited her from all over the country to come and give talks about her work. And I do just want to mention one of the things I just have been most admiring of her for is again, that care with which she treats the people in her database. It's very important to her to have a photo of every person. So she goes and she finds a photo of every single person in her database. And she tries to make sure it's like a good photo, right? Like not a mugshot, not some crappy thing, but a photo that ideally the person or their family would be proud of. And one of the most touching things is she was telling us about how if she can't find a good enough photo, she'll find the best one she can find of them. She'll personally like retouch it. So she retouches the photo before it goes in her database, which I just find really beautiful to think about. So that's her work. And that effort is truly amazing. It's literally like one person is behind it. And she's like an amazing person who really deserves to get more I would say like attention and elevation of the work that she's doing, because I think she has a lot to teach us in the US about feminicide. And then Sovereign Bodies Institute is another just incredible organization. They're specifically looking at missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and people, very much focused on the Indigenous context. This MMIW sort of human rights crisis is very much part of the broader conversation about feminicide, but it's happening in very specific ways, kind of like here in the United States and also in Canada context. So it has its whole own like movement specifically for Indigenous women and girls. And so they're the keeper, that organization keeps a database, again, to the best of their knowledge, all of the cases that they've been able to find. Broadly speaking, they started with US and Canada, but then their database has actually grown and expanded to other countries as well. One of the things I find really inspiring about them is they're very family oriented. So they're always working directly with the families who've been impacted by these murders. And they go by a model of like family governance. So even if somebody comes to share, they want the data that they have, let's say, they consult with the families. Or if the families want to, for example, collect a new column of data, they'll incorporate that into the database. So I think they embody this model of like very responsive kind of healing, grounded in healing for families and communities specifically. Sovereign Bodies is one of the ones too that I think is very interesting because of their turning away from the state. Whereas some groups are like making demands on the state, Sovereign Bodies is really like, they told me directly, Anita said, we do this work for sovereignty and for kinship. Like, we don't do it to get stuff from the state, basically. Like, this work is about us. It's about us helping ourselves. And so I think their Indigenous methods around data sovereignty and kinship kind of at the center is actually pretty different from some of these other groups, which are kind of about trying to rally the state for more visibility, let's say.
The statistics on feminicide on Indigenous women is stark and frightening. We think it's bad universally, but the count, the data on murder of Indigenous women is all that much higher by some terrible ratio. So you talk about a concept you call necropolitics, and can you talk about what that is really?
This is a concept from a philosopher, Mbembe, created it as a counterpoint to Michel Foucault has this concept of biopolitics, which is the power to distribute life. But Mbembe is really talking about necropolitics, which is who has the power to kill and what are the differential ways in which death is distributed amongst the population. So I think this helps us think about, for example, like why women are more prone to gender-based violence, premature death, and so on and so forth. So there's it helps us to think about differential exposures to risk of death. But I think the word is also interesting because it can help us think about how activists mobilize death as a political topic in a way. And that's very much what we see with the whole social movement around feminicides and other like MMIW and so on. It's in a way like a mobilization of the politics of grief to say like we are missing these people that are beloved to us, these people that should be in the world, we are missing them from a structural phenomenon that is preventable. And so I think that's where like you get into the necropolitics because it's mobilizing deaths in a way like rhetorical rallying point to say like, it should not be like this, right? We should not be missing these people. These people should be here. And in fact, that's what we see with a lot of the ways that the very creative, I would say, ways that activists present feminicide in public spaces, for example. It's often through this absence. So they'll set up shoes, for example. So empty shoes arranged in a public square with no bodies filling them. Or the same with chairs. There was a group in Argentina, Mujeres de Negro Rosario, who set up 250 chairs outside of the local court building to say, like, these are the people that should be with us in this space. and yet their bodies are not here. And so I think it's again like a kind of really interesting strategy of saying, yeah, these people are missing, but also how can we take action now to stop this from happening again?
Yeah. Another aspect of necropolitics, I suppose, it's also about like who do we count and who don't we count. And sure, woman is one category, but then there's the intersectional, like you talked about before, about who ends up in the media, who ends up in a sensational sort of story, and who can't you find in the media narratives, who disappears.
Exactly right. Like necropolitics is sort of saying like whose lives matter.
Yeah. So you talk about this interesting tension in this book about the act of keeping numbers or counting is sort of like a dehumanizing, or it's reducing things to numbers and columns and facts and figures, but also that the whole act of counting murdered women is a humanizing act in itself. And if you can talk about that contradiction in a way.
Yeah, there's a whole chapter in the book called Refusing and Using Data. And it's sort of about this tension, in fact, because activists are very aware of this tension. And I agree with it. Nobody's life can be put into a row of data, into a set of columns, and be fully represented. It's like that's definitely an act of reduction and does not, of course, ever accurately reflect the kind of like complex reality that is the person's life unfolding in the world. But the activists know this, but then they still do it. And I think that's one of the like really interesting things is like, despite the fact that they know it, and then also despite the fact that all of them, I would say, really value testimony and lived experience, the quantification and counting and categorizing and analysis is kind of a strategic way to get access to people actually paying attention to what they actually want to say about feminicide. And so they all use data, they produce data, but then when they communicate about data, they're always almost trying to call attention back to the ways in which the data themselves are imperfect. The data that they themselves collected are imperfect. And so we saw it over and over again, the way that they communicate, like if they're showing counts after a year or like charts about a year of violence, they say things like, no somos números, we are not numbers. Or like, these are not numbers, they are lives that were taken from us. So in a lot of their communication, they're both communicating with numbers, but they're also telling us how numbers are inadequate and can't actually capture the full scope of the phenomenon. They're not using data naively, and they're almost always trying to humanize the data, but they're still reducing and counting and putting people's lives into spreadsheets. It's irresolvable, but it's a tension they sit in and kind of go back and forth in. And it's not really reconcilable. It's a tension that doing this work actually just carries with it.
You talk about the concept of that they're defending life, quoting here, how their counter data production was not about quantifying the dead, but about defending life itself.
Yeah, that was one of the big feedbacks I got in writing the book. One of the activists in Ecuador, Geraldina Guerra, she said, Catherine, I need you to make this point. We are not counting the dead. So many people think we're counting the dead. I myself have heard this about this work where people dismiss it as not having value because counting is, let's say, dehumanizing, or it's not worthwhile, or they can't have a complete count, or whatever the case might be. Geraldina was like very forceful in saying, this is the message that needs to get out into the world. This is not about death. Like, this is about life. This is our work to defend life itself. And that's the message that needs to be said. And I think that's echoed in so many ways by the work of the other activists as well, where it's not about having a perfect picture of the past. Like, that's not why they're doing this work. It's like this kind of retrospective, in the same way that, let's say, in the genocide, like we go back and then we try to get this like accurate picture of what happened. So then it could be like mounted in a legal defense in an international court or something like that. That's like not the work that they're doing. The work is actually about preventing, eliminating feminicide for the future. It's about defending of the lives of the women that are living now. That for me was a really important realization in the process of doing this work.
Yeah, you even write, you say it's not about solving the problem, it's about showing the problem,
That's right.
demonstrating the problem. Obviously, doing this work takes a toll, and I think that's very obvious by your stories.
Yeah.
And you talk about that, but you also talk about like how the communities in these grassroots groups find ways of working together and creating sort of like drawing strength from each other.
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, the work is pretty excruciating. It's very manual, it's sort of artisanal. It, literally involves like reading hundreds of news articles and like copying and pasting little details into spreadsheets or databases, checking on individual facts, like how old was she, where was the location, etc. And I would say it's the emotional toll is also because the way that media report on the phenomena of feminicide and gender related violence is so misogynistic. It's like sensationalized. It's often racist. It's like sensational to sell newspapers. It's lurid. The activists are sort of like exposed to this violence of just even the depiction of the violence. And then they have to work with that information, but like discard the framing of it because the framing is just like so damaging and harmful. Everyone that we interviewed basically talked about the emotional toll that it took on them, and they all have strategies to mitigate it. Some people don't look at the news right in the morning. Some people don't look at it late at night just to affect their sort of psyche. Everybody talked about how certain cases have stayed with them, and it's sort of like after they read it, and it often were cases about like children or girls, cases that felt so wrong for them. They would come back to them and think about them. But then people did find, I would say, other strategies of navigating were working collectively. And this is where we've heard from the people like Maria and Elena Suarez Val, the folks that work individually. They said, in particular, since they don't do the work collectively, it's been so helpful for them to come together in community and like talk about the work, because otherwise it can be very isolating, when you're sitting there full of all these stories that you've read and have no place to really process them with people, especially because, again, they do involve a certain level of like care, even though it's care for strangers. Like in most cases, they don't personally know these people, but they are moved to care for these people and care for their memories in these spreadsheets. And so having some kind of like collective way to process that and work through that was very important.
It did strike me throughout that there isn't much focus on the perpetrator or male violence as a subject. Can you talk about why that isn't?
Yeah. In almost no cases, in very few cases, did the groups even collect that information. And actually, I talked about this exact question with Elena because in her work monitoring about Uruguay, she had a realization a couple years into doing the work that she wasn't collecting any information about the men, and that it's like the men were completely absent from the story. I think it's attention some folks recognize, but I agree with you. I think it's gotten less attention overall in the movement. But some activists are collecting information about the men. So, for example, Dawn Wilcox in the US, she has a whole section about the perpetrator, his name, birthplace, all sorts of information about him. She's trying to kind of address that side of it as well, so that one could look in a data-driven way at not only the victims of the feminicide, but also the perpetrators of feminicide, and potentially also look for patterns of behavior there as well. And in fact, actually, one interesting thing is my other collaborator, Silvana Fumega, she and her organization developed a protocol for like a data standard for which data should be collected about a feminicide. And this is more for the government side because they were more working with governments. But in their suggested data standard, there's a whole section, an equal section for the perpetrator. All the same information, more or less, you'd collect about the victim, you would also collect it about the perpetrator. So things like educational level, place of origin, blah, blah, blah. But again, like the protocol is actually really good, but is it implemented anywhere? No. So that's sort of where we're at. But I think that is one of that could be considered like a gold standard for governments, at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just thinking it's a form of invisibilizing also, in that we're not seeing, or maybe it's just such an accepted reality to us all that men are violent. Now we just accept and normalize it. I'm not sure. But one of the things that you talked about before, which I think is so the most moving sort of use of these statistics, are these like large sort of events and artistic or art installations. And it's funny, I saw the cover of your book and I thought it was just like a graphic with like block letter women's names. And I thought it was just a graphic. And then I looked at it a little bit and I realized that it's a bird's eye view of the Zocalo in Mexico City Plaza with women's names just laid out across the whole thing. And it's very, like, once you discover what that is, it's very chilling. But can you talk a little bit about like the different art activism or artivism?
I had to cut that chapter a lot because I wanted to talk about so many examples of kind of like where the data go and the creative ways that activists use them. But yeah, I think, for example, the installation in the Zocalo is by a group called Colectiva SJF. This was in 2020. And they installed, they're very large stencils of women's names. So they're like probably like 3 feet high letters of more than, I think, 250 women. And they put them in the Zocalo. And it was on International Women's Day, the intervention. And so they had this beautiful photography of it as well. And I was also very taken by that project and the image because of the way in which it's also very symbolic. So the Zocalo is one of the main public squares of Mexico City. It's near the seat of government. There's a kind of a claiming of space that is happening there. Also, like, I think invocation of these names of people who we have lost and kind of like inscribing them in public space and kind of trying to hold the institutions accountable for their absence. It's so monumental. I think that's the largest, just spatially speaking, that's the largest artwork that I have come across in this work. And it's so striking. Another one I'll mention is a kind of more quiet, but really lovely project, which was done in Uruguay by some embroidery artists. They took the data from Elena's database from a particular year, I think it's 2021 or 2020 maybe, or 2019, 1 year of feminicide. So there may be like 27 people killed in that year. And they created this participatory embroidery project. And so they did a call for artists and said, if you want to participate in this remembrance, give us your name. And so they found one person for each of the 27 people who were killed. They sent them a piece of cloth and a thread and a name of a person. And each person stitched that name into the cloth and then sent it back to the two artists. And then they stitched the cloths all together into this like beautiful, very long, sadly very long, sort of scrolling cloth of embroidered names. And the names are embroidered each with like a very different style. So like some are super neat and clean. Some are more like florid and have these little flourishes of embroidery, but then they're all linked together by the two artists. And then they've used that, they've displayed it at a number of different locations and at rallies and things like that. And so I just love that project because they have a little film about it on Instagram and talked a little bit about, it was like this sort of collective attempt again at like the recuperation of memory and like trying to collectively connect with the people that were lost and make those connections through their hands and through their bodies in a way. Cortar el hilo, so it's cutting the thread is the name of the project. And it's by Alejandra Garcia and Marby Blanco. I got to see it in person, the embroidered cloth. And it's, like they say in Spanish, impresionante, like very impressive, I guess, like just sort of stunning to see it all together. We actually all, like they unfurled it and I was there with them, the artists, and with my colleagues, Silvana and Elena on this project. And we all just like cried. It was like very I don't know. It's really like emotional as they told the story of it.
And embroidery is such a women's art and skill
It
and
is.
craft, also textile from ancient
That's right.
times.
That's right. Exactly.
Thank you so much for giving me this time and for talking with me about this work. It's so important to know, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with my listeners.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love to know your thoughts on these conversations, so please drop a note on the website or find us on social media. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Subject to Power on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, El Kamihira. Audio engineering is done by Jason Sheasley at Abridged Audio. Cover art by B. Johnson, and music by Beware of Darkness.